Wildfire season is in full swing in Montana. It has been super hot and the grass has been getting some heat stress.
Come on, Nigel.
With the added sugars, I had to pull Gus off of the pasture. Since a lot of the grass is drying up, I want to get as many horses out on the pasture as possible. Gus has been in the barn and then in the small arena for turnout the last couple of days. Little Gus, Pete, and Stewie have been in the big pasture. They were able to eat grass all last night.
Come on, boys.
In preparation for today's activities, I have divided this big dry lot into 2 sections. It isn't supposed to be super hot today, so after I'm done filling up the water, I am going to make sure everything is ready to turn Whiplash and Goose out with the boys. I have noticed that all of the horses have been a little bit down the last couple of days.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's the weather or if they just really,
Nice.
really missed me while I was away on my trip. Stewie and little Gus have been especially snuggly.
Pete.
Pete is best friends with Gus and he's taking the separation a little bit hard. He's just a little bit depressed. The other boys are being really nice to him, but I think he's just a little bit down about not being able to hang out with Gus.
Pete.
Pretty much every spring I end up having to take Gus off of the pasture, so Pete is used to this. I am regretting setting up the panels inside this dry lot. Now, I do think these boys are going to be able to get along with Whiplash and Goose pretty easily.
Pete. Pete.
I think all of them have been turned out together before. There is definitely enough room for 5 horses in this giant dry lot. I am just not sure if they're all going to be able to share the run-in shed. Before I put everyone out together, I am going to distribute a bunch of hay piles for them. Pete, little Gus, and Stewie have been outside all night and they have been able to graze, but it hasn't been really enticing for them since the grass is so dry. The addition of a few piles of alfalfa and their dry lot should entice them enough to hopefully not get too upset with each other. All of the horses are looking really good this time of year. If anything, they're getting a little bit on the chubby side. It's not a really big deal. They could use some extra weight for the winter. These boys will not say no to a little alfalfa snack, so they just dig right in as soon as I get it in their dry lot. There was a crazy thunder and lightning storm last night with quite a bit of rain that knocked down the smoke, but it blew right back in, so hopefully it doesn't get any worse than this. I have a really hard time about getting excited to ride or work the horses when the weather's like this. For anybody that has never experienced this kind of smoke or particulates in the air, it's a lot like having really bad allergies. Your eyes will water, sometimes it could be hard to breathe. I am pretty sensitive to the smoke depending on what exactly is burning, and I'll get migraines if I am out in it too long. I did have a little bit of a pity party for myself yesterday because I was super excited to get home and finally work the horses. Living in a place with this kind of extreme weather can really bring you down some days, so I'm trying to be positive today. It is looking like it's going to be quite warm the next couple of days, so I'm going to take advantage of this and get a bunch of chores done. With all of the horses going kind of stir crazy, it will help them to be turned out on pasture. My initial plan was to take Goose and turn him out with the boys by himself, but it looks like I might cause a little bit too much stress to Whiplash if I do that. For those of you that do not know, Whiplash was 16 years old and a basically
Goose.
untrained stallion when I bought him.
Come on.
After he was gelded, he did have a little bit of trouble integrating into a herd environment, so most of the time he just hangs out with
Come on,
Goose.
Goose.
I got these two boys around the same time, so naturally they became friends. I feel like over the last year, Whiplash has finally started to docile down a bit. Just looking at him, you would never guess that he is 20 years
Boys?
old. I sneakily deposited Goose and Whiplash into the big pasture. Now all I have to do is wait for the other boys to figure out that they're in here. The first order of business for these two boys is to inspect all of the poop piles in the vicinity. It is going to be really interesting to see who comes out on top after this. I have a feeling that Whiplash is going to try and take control of the herd of 3 horses. Typically, when I take Big Gus out of the mix, Pete will end up as the top dog in their little tiny herd. But recently I've noticed that Stewie has been a little bit more bold. And as soon as Stewie noticed that Whiplash and Goose were in their pasture, he head out to investigate. After a brief reintroduction, these boys were off and running. Stewie's intimidation tactics did not deter Whiplash one bit. Last year, Stewie was shorter than Whiplash, and this year he is a few inches taller, so I think that gave him the confidence he needed to challenge him. They did a little bit more sniffing, and Whiplash was not going to give up that easily. Whiplash pretty easily took control of the herd and led them back towards the dry lot. With Stewie trailing behind, they headed back in to see what little Gus was up to. I was really hoping that these boys would keep it out in the pasture while they figured out the new herd hierarchy, but it looks like Whiplash wants to make sure little Gus knows who's boss as well. Little Gus was just minding his own business, enjoying his breakfast when Whiplash came in and pushed him around a little bit. I've noticed since little Gus has become more comfortable in his surroundings that he is very low on the totem pole overall. He doesn't really care where he's at in the herd. He just likes to have access to food. It looks like all of the boys have pretty much settled down for now. Whiplash takes one more spin around the periphery of the dry lot. These two boys seem pretty content with their new places in the herd, so they'll probably go and enjoy some of the breakfast with the other boys. I did put out enough hay this morning so that there were multiple places that these boys could eat spread out so they aren't bothering each other. But because horses are herd animals, it looks like all these boys are kind of clumped together, sharing the same 4 piles of hay. As they start to settle in, I notice that Stewie seems to be up to something. His first attempt to take over the herd did not pan out like he planned, and I'm guessing that he's going to try again after these boys all get a snack and maybe a drink. I can definitely tell he's got something percolating in his tiny little horse brain.
Boys?
If you guys watch my video when I introduced Skeletor and Ziggy, it went a little bit differently than it did today. There was no mares that these boys had to contend with, and all of them are old enough that they're pretty chill now. Besides Whiplash, all of these horses grew up in a herd setting. Stewie is probably the only one that doesn't quite get it all of the time yet. He is much too mischievous and playful. Like I said earlier, little Gus really just seems to be preoccupied on food. He doesn't care at all where he is in the herd. With everybody seeming to get along quite nicely, I am going to remove the panels from this dry lot. One of the really nice things about all these boys getting along is I can feed them all of their meals in here without too much trouble. After only about 10 minutes of a reintroduction, they are happily munching on their breakfast. I do typically feed these horses ration balancer and multivitamin, and right now they're getting kind of like an electrolyte because it's so hot. I'm thinking I'll probably hold off on that for a couple of days just until they really figure out where they are in the herd. I would be really surprised if anything changes. I think Whiplash is going to be in charge for the duration. All of these boys do know where the water is at, and I've been having to fill up this tank every single day. They've been drinking it down to about half full. I've also been making a giant puddle for them, so if they want to lay down and roll around and cool off, they certainly can. It's a huge bummer not being able to see the mountains, but believe it or not, it will get smokier as the summer progresses. I'm really surprised Whiplash hadn't done this sooner, but this is a phlegm response. In horses, this is used to waft specific pheromones and chemical messages closer to a very specific organ that helps them interpret what they may mean. Because Whiplash was a stallion for so long, I'm guessing he is just habitually going around and smelling all the manure piles, checking for a mare in heat. Even though Whiplash has been gelded for a number of years, there are certain stallion behaviors that he does still do. Last year when I turned Whiplash out with all of these boys, he did go around and smell every single pile of manure in the pasture and in the dry lot just to make sure there weren't any mares hiding anywhere. Some of you guys give me a really hard time about never turning Prim out with the boys, and it really does create a whole set of problems that I just do not want to deal with. Even with Whiplash doing some stallion-like behaviors, all of these boys can get along very well in the first couple of minutes of them being reintroduced to each other. I can tell, however, that Stewie is still being a little bit mischievous and he isn't quite content to do exactly what Whiplash is telling him yet.
Hi, Stu.
Most of the horses really don't care what I think, but Stewie is really interested in gaining my approval, so he comes over for some extra scratches. I do spend a lot of time with these horses, but I don't really feel like I'm a part of their herd necessarily. They spend a lot of time without me in sight, and so they need to work this out on their own. Stewie has always been very snuggly, and he really does enjoy the company of humans. He figured out at an early age that we are really good for scratching the inside of those hard to reach places. Even though Stewie was at risk when I bought him at auction, he really had no rough handling. I mean, he had no handling at all, so that is perfect. Since it hasn't really been very long since these boys were turned out together, I am going to observe them while I bring some of these panels out of the dry lot. Stewie is seemingly minding his own business, and Whiplash goes right in just to let him know that he is actually in charge of everybody in this pen. He really wasn't outwardly threatened by any of the horses, but I think he can tell that Stewie is just not quite on board with this new herd dynamic just quite yet.
You okay, Pete? You okay, Pete?
Typically in the past, Pete would put up a little bit more of a fight. It seems like over the last year, he has really kind of dociled down, which it's taking quite a while to get there. Frisco Bill used to be out with all of the boys, and he was in charge for a very long time. A few years ago, all of them collectively decided that he was not going to be in charge anymore, and they ran him around quite a bit, and I made the decision to give him his own space. I was a little bit worried that they were going to give Whiplash the runaround as well, but Whiplash is not nearly as old as Frisco Bill was when they decided not to have him be a part of their herd anymore. I don't have a very big herd of horses, but there are quite a lot of herd dynamics that I can see from year to year, and they do change quite often as the horses age or become more comfortable with being here. As I continue to bring in a few more panels, you can see that Whiplash and Goose spring off to do another check of the perimeter. One thing I have noticed about Whiplash is he takes the responsibility of keeping his herd in tip-top shape very seriously. He spends a lot of time even out on pasture checking the fence and making sure there are no intruders and nobody is infiltrating his herd. I think that Pete might actually be enjoying just the time to relax and not having to worry about where Gus is. With Whiplash doing all of the heavy lifting for their new herd, it is going to give him a lot more time to just chill out. I felt a little bit bad for Goose while he was trying to roll over up this little hill. If he wasn't quite so round, I bet he probably could have gotten it done.
Stewie.
In normal Stewie fashion, he had to be all up in my business and see just exactly what I was doing with the panels. Whiplash was inspecting some more manure piles, just making sure there were no mares around that he needed to take over.
Okay.
I was a little bit worried that it might get out of hand today, but it looks like these boys are really settling in nicely and they're going to have no problems with the new herd arrangement. Because I don't want to do any more unnecessary work, I am just going to bring this panel to the side for now so the horses can come and go as they please. After today, if they're looking like they are going to remain friends, then I'll just take all of these panels out and put them somewhere else. I think Stewie had gotten really used to me handling him every day. I was getting him ready to start his undersaddle training right before I left for vacation. During a very serious ear massage, I noticed that Whiplash and Goose went out to the pasture and Pete followed them. It is not uncommon when you put a bunch of new horses together that they might have a big first introduction and then go back and kind of hammer out all the details of where exactly everybody falls in the hierarchy of the herd. I am guessing that Stewie might try and challenge Whiplash again just for fun. Goose has no interest in being near the top, and neither does Pete, but Stewie thinks that he might be able to take over this little herd.
Good boys.
I think in the end, Stewie realized that the juice was just not worth the squeeze, and all of the extra work that comes along with taking care of even a small little herd was better left with a horse that knew what they were doing. After a very slight altercation, it looks like these boys are finally falling in line. When the dust finally settled, it was pretty obvious that Whiplash was definitely going to be in charge of the new herd. It seems like he really does enjoy the responsibility of taking care of all of these other horses. He spent a lot of his life being the only horse turned out and only bred a handful of mares over the 16 years his previous owner had him. He has been started under saddle and I have ridden him a few times, but he seems to be most at ease when he's looking after the other horses and gets to be out and walk around all day in the pasture. It's important to me that when I take these horses in, I'm able to find something that they're really good at. Due to the amount of time that Whiplash spent as a stallion, this is the activity that he really likes the most. Being in charge of a small herd, even if it contains no mares, is really where I feel he is probably the most happy. It has now been only about a half an hour since I initially turned these boys out, and I think they're happy to be out on the grass. I feel pretty confident that when I leave this afternoon that all of these boys will be able to get along. Stewie, Little Gus, and Pete continued munching on their breakfast. When I do switch around the herd like this, I do make sure to keep a close eye on Little Gus because he does get pretty stressed very easily. So a change like this could lead him to develop ulcers, which he is particularly at risk for. One thing that I did not expect to happen today was Pete came over and was asking me to scratch him. If you've been watching my channel for a while, this is really out of character for Pete. He seems like he's having a pretty serious internal battle about it. He gets a little bit frightened and steps away for a moment.
It's all right.
This is a pretty good opportunity for me to let him know that scratching him is not a big deal, and even when he walks away, I'll come back and be pretty nice to him. Pete had a pretty rough go with a previous trainer, and he has been really hard to gain his trust over the years. I have had him for a very long time, and he still is
Yeah,
convinced
buddy.
that maybe one day, if he's not paying attention or if he lets his guard down, that I'm going to be really nasty to him. He takes a pretty long time to calm down, and he typically does not let me scratch him like this out in the dry lot or in the pasture. I don't have any treats with me today, so he's staying here just because he purely wants me to scratch him. I can tell that he still is pretty uncomfortable, and he's still in a little bit of a flight or fight state. It may not look very obvious, but I know Pete pretty well, and hopefully in a minute or two he will finally relax and actually enjoy these scratches. He still has a lot of tension in his eyes, and I can tell he's squeezing his little lips shut, and he is just not quite comfortable with what I'm doing. I used to ride very well-bred, well-broke horses, and they're fun for a lot of people, but a horse like Pete really is why I continue to enjoy training horses. It's really surprising that Pete is letting me do this. He does have a bunch of scars around his ears. He had an ear twitch used on him so many times that he does have some scarring, and the hair is actually grown back in white. I was totally caught off guard by Pete today. I don't know what brought on this snuggle session because this has never happened before. He stuck around for around 5 minutes and just let me gently scratch him and rub him all over before he started sniffing me, which was a huge surprise. I've had Pete for 7 years and he has not done this to me a single time. After
It's okay,
hanging out
Pete.
with Pete for about 5 minutes, he finally started to relax. It is really obvious when Pete finally starts
buddy.
to feel comfortable. His eyes will soften, his mouth will relax, and he'll do a pretty long lick and chew. This just indicates that he is switching over from his tiny little horse brain thinking about running away or fighting me and into a
Pete.
more relaxed state.
You okay?
Seems like a really minor thing for a 10-year-old horse, but Pete is not a normal horse, and it was really exciting that I got to experience that with him today. I'd like to think it was all of my persistent horse training over the years, but I have a sneaking suspicion that him seeing Stewie and I interact has made a big difference for Pete just in the last couple of days. After today's interaction, I am filled with a little bit more hope that maybe one day Pete will be able to function more like a normal horse. For a lot of people, a 10-year-old horse is at the end of their usable career, which I just think is ridiculous. I have a feeling that Pete is going to be a real late bloomer, and the next 10 years of his life is where he's really going to shine.
Bye, Pete.
I puttered around the barn for a while, doing chores here and there and keeping an eye on what the boys were doing. This is only phase 1 of the big switch up I'm doing of all of the horses. Gus and Studman have been turned out together before on a dry lot. They may come in here to spend the summer, but I might turn Frisco Bill and Ziggy out in there so they can take advantage of the grass. I am gonna go home for lunch and then head to the store and pick up a few things so I can strip all of the stalls in the barn and finish rearranging all of the horses later on this evening. Thank you guys so much for watching and stay tuned for the next video.